Thank you, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be here, and I love New Orleans, so it's been a treat to be able to walk around and be reminded of how beautiful this city is, so thank you for inviting me. This is a slightly different story. I know I went upstairs and looked at the European theater and the Pacific theater displays, which are very powerful and moving, and so this is going to be a different look at World War II and what happened to the people who were living on the West Coast. As the book is called The Art of Gaman, and I'm going to see if I could advance this. Most people say, what is Gaman? Is that one of the camps? No. Gaman is what pretty much, when I started borrowing these objects from individuals, and most of the objects were borrowed, people would say, this was our way to Gaman. This was our way to grin and bear it. And after the publisher rejected like 20 of my titles, including Desolate Beauty, which I really wanted, and they felt that it sounded like a romance novel, so I wasn't allowed to have that. But after proposing a dozen or more titles, I proposed The Art of Gaman, and oddly enough, they accepted it, because I thought, nobody's going to be able to pronounce it. They're not going to know what it means, But anyway, I think it sort of captures the spirit in which things were made in the camps. This is the book cover, which you could buy outside. This whole project started because of a bird pin, which I am wearing, and when my mother died in 2000, I happened to be going through my parents' garage, and I saw this strange, dusty box in one of the crevices, and I opened it up, and just out of curiosity, it was a little wooden jewelry box, so that made it even stranger that it should be sitting in the garage. And inside, I found this bird pin, some other trinkets, some things that were obviously from Italy, and from the looks of all the objects, I figured out that it must have been from World War II, and this bird pin was one of the things that was made in camp. And so I started wearing the bird pin. I liked it. I thought, I think I'll wear it. And that's when my friend Kit Heinrichs, who designed my book, saw me wearing the pin. He asked where it came from, and I said, I think it was made in camp. And he said, and oddly enough, we had just finished a book called Long May She Wave, which is on the American flag. And so we were prowling around for another book to do, and he said, it might make a good book. And I said, yeah, and so that's how this whole thing started. It was very innocent. My parents, as all the Niseis who second-generation Japanese Americans, never talked about the camps. They didn't talk about it to their children. They didn't talk about the camps to anybody in the community. So I knew very little about what the camps were. I knew that they were in camp. I knew that it wasn't a good place to be. But, you kind of grew up knowing you're not supposed to ask questions. I describe it as talking about an uncle with a venereal disease or something. You were told, you sort of understood that this wasn't something that you were supposed to bring up. For the Japanese American, December 7th, 1941 had a different impact. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that day, the FBI swooped in. They started arresting people in homes. They started searching the homes of Japanese Americans. And by the end of the day, they had arrested several hundred Japanese American men. They didn't have any reason to charge them with any crime, but it was either that they were community leaders, they were martial arts teachers. Someone said that her brother was arrested because he worked for the stock exchange and ran the teletype machines. The the fishermen, there was a great fishing community. When people got off their fishing boats on December 7th, they were pretty much arrested as soon as they got off the boat. So anyone who was deemed a possible danger was immediately arrested. They were taken away. Their families weren't sure where they were. They were not charged with the crime, and in some cases, some were released after a few months. Some spent the duration of the war in these separate Justice Department-run camps. So as I said, the Japanese, the FBI started searching everyone's home. It was all-out panic on the West Coast. My mother was saying that when, because they knew that the FBI didn't know that they didn't read Japanese or anything, people just started burning anything that was written in Japanese. They started taking things that they were afraid would be deemed suspicious, and in farm country, they were throwing it down outhouse wells. They were breaking them. My mother said that my grandmother, because they were afraid that they would find reason to arrest somebody, they burned all the record albums in Japanese. Anything written in Japanese was burned. My grandmother was the secretary of the Buddhist Church Women's Club. And when her husband reached to burn the minutes of the Women's Club meeting, and if you could imagine what meetings are like, it's like, who brought the tea the last time? Who brought the crackers to the last meeting? How many pounds of rice did we have for the Cherry Blossom Festival? When my grandfather tried to burn it, my grandmother apparently drew the line. She said, this is taking it too far. She put it in a coffee can. She took it out into the field and buried it, which scared everybody, because if the FBI found out that there was something so precious that it was buried out in the field, she could have definitely been arrested. But anyway, this is the fear that broke out right after Pearl Harbor. Of course, as being here, you know that at the early weeks of the war, the Japanese were winning on a number of fronts. If you look at how many countries they invaded and how they were winning these battles, there was a great deal of fear. And also, nobody had ever attacked the American territory before, so that compounded it. On the West Coast, people started, because there was so much animosity against the Japanese Americans, and people started shooting out their houses, and this person put up a sign in front of his store in Oakland saying that he's an American citizen. He was a UC Berkeley graduate, and so these signs were going up everywhere. I think there's in places like Seattle, people started wearing buttons. The Chinese try to distinguish themselves by saying, "I'm Chinese, I'm not Japanese." So, there was a real attempt to separate themselves from the so-called suspicious people. This is the order that 11 weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And for Japanese Americans, that's that's sort of the marking point of what everything in their life changing. And when they decided to start evacuating people, these signs went up on telephone poles, on storefronts, saying that everyone had a week to report in to an assembly point. And so they, if you look at the order, and you see when it was issued, this one was May. They had basically a week. We were told that they could only take what they could carry, and what they had to carry, they had to include their bedding and their eating utensils. And it said that this order applied to citizens or aliens as well as non-aliens. And non-alien, of course, is your American citizen. So 2/3 of the people who went into camp were American citizens. This order went. It covered. Let me see if the next one is the map. See, this is how they found out about it. That's the sign. That's the order written in Japanese. And this is Little Tokyo. And then, because you had a week and you couldn't take anything, people start having just fire sales, everything. And stores were knocking prices off. My parents had just planted their crop in Fresno. They were farmers, and Dad had bought a new tractor, and they had just planted the crop and didn't have time to harvest it. So when they put stuff in storage, and when we came out, everything was stolen. So that there was more of the, and this is how people. So 1 minute you're running a store, you're fishing, you're a gardener, and here they're lined up and being loaded into trains, and you have your numbered tag that you had to wear. And this Santa Anita, I think they were one of the first groups to be evacuated. These words evacuated, internment camps, all of that. These are when before the war started, or at the start of the war, Roosevelt was referring to the camps as concentration camps. And then it's only later in the war that they start talking about them as relocation, internment camps. I think that they're going back to calling it concentration camps. The dark gray areas where all the people who lived within the dark gray area on the West Coast were ordered into camp. Now, at the time, out of 127,000 Japanese Americans or Japanese living in the U.S., 120,000 lived on the West Coast. So when they said that it only applied to the West Coast, well, that applied to 90% of all ethnic Japanese living in the U.S. It happened so fast, by March, 3 months after Pearl Harbor, they were already starting some of the evacuation, and they couldn't get the camps built fast enough. So they did it in a couple of phases. One is that they said, okay, we're going to make assembly points so that people could go into. They were racetracks, they were fairgrounds, and so initially they put the Japanese into assembly points near their home city. And when the permanent camps were built, then they were shipped into, the permanent camps were all 8 of them were in desert, 2 were in Arkansas. Arkansas was swampland. But they did it in 2 phases. One thing that's very interesting is it was kind of arbitrary. With Arizona, the Phoenix, Phoenix was divided in half. I'm looking at this thing. So the line ran along Grand Avenue, Van Buren, Mill Avenue, and the Southern Pacific Railroad. If you lived on one side of Grand Avenue, you didn't have to go into camp. If you lived on the other side, you did. This is something that was, if how is one person living on one side of the street an enemy and dangerous, and how is on the other side you're not? I keep looking for that answer and asking how they arrived at this. Somebody said, well, they are afraid that people would be helping, there would be spies or something sneaking across the Mexican border into Arizona. But even that doesn't make sense. Why would you divide a city in half? And I guess Phoenix wasn't the only one. There were some other areas where they divided a city in half and only made half the residents go into camp. If you got the answer to that, I'd like to know. The order to evacuate people included everybody. As I said, there were, according to the 1940 census, there are 127,000 ethnic Japanese living in the entire continental 48 U.S., 48 states. 120,000 of them lived on the West Coast. So when the order came down to report to camp, that included 90% of all ethnic Japanese living in the United States. Of those 120,000, 2/3 were American citizens. They were born in the United States. The government cut off immigration to the U.S. in 1925, I believe. And so even the first generation, the Issei's, the immigrant generation, had been in the U.S. at least 20 years. And because there was this gap, the first wave of people who came to this country from Japan were mostly men, and then they sent for picture brides later. Most of the people were under 17. The average age in camp was 17 years old. So this is, then people like my brother was 2 years old when he was sent into camp. My sister was in camp. So anyway, this is the order said that there were no exceptions, and they took old people and very young people. They took blind people. This man had Parkinson's disease. If you were in a hospital, you were taken out of the hospital and sent into camp. And if you couldn't walk, you were carried on a pallet. The other thing, this is what caught me off guard, because because my parents never talked about the camps, and nor did anybody else, and also because in their lives there was this tiny little part of, they were living their own drama and having to get ready to go into camp, but they didn't know that because they were determined not to have one drop of Japanese blood on the West Coast, they took orphans out of orphanages, they took children out of foster care facilities, and they sent them to camp. All of the orphans were sent to Manzanar and put in a segregated area of the camp called Children's Village. Also, because at the time, there was mixed marriages were illegal on the West Coast, and so there were a number of half Japanese. A lot of these kids ended up in orphanages. So about 20% of the children didn't even know they were Japanese until they ended up in camp. They did an interview with somebody on 60 Minutes, so about 20, 30 years ago, and he said he simply didn't know. Suddenly he was taken out of his foster care home and sent into camp. So this, and I guess when General DeWitt did his final report, he admitted that the least amount of Japanese blood in camp was 1/16. So there was this ethnic cleansing of the West Coast was pretty thorough. As I said, when they did this, it happened so fast. They went from, December 7th, and then by February 11th or 19th, Roosevelt signed the executive order. A couple of weeks later, they started evacuating people. They didn't have any of the permanent camps built yet, so people were sent in to live in horse stalls in racetracks. This is Tanforan racetrack, and so and it all happened so fast that basically they cleared out the horses and sort of washed it down, and this is what where they ended up living the first few weeks, months of the war. And they could only take what they could carry. What they could carry had to include their bedding and their eating utensils. So here, their luggage was thrown in a pile, and they had to go get it and take it to their barrack. And there was a metal cot and a mattress where you were supposed to take it to the straw pile and fill your mattress ticking with straw. This is another picture from the Tanforan racetrack. They were really told that the assembly center was supposed to be very temporary. They said just while we're building the permanent camps, but they hadn't started building the camps yet. So people ended up staying there 4 months, 6 months, and so they started planning their own victory garden. And you see curtains put up in the horse stalls. And you also see the community mop and gardening tools. And the sign says, "Mop for building, please return." So there some kind of communal life started and forming in these racetrack communities. Initially, the government thought they could evacuate people quickly, but when they tried to establish camps, the other cities and inland cities said, "Hey, if you think these people are dangerous on the West Coast, we have power plants, we have dams that could be blown up. We don't want them in our area." So what happened was they had to find surplus land, and most of the land were in the desert areas. Two of the camps, the camps in Arizona and Poston and Gila, were on Indian reservations. But to build these camps, they had to first build the roads to bring the materials to build them. And so this is building the roads to get to build the camps. Now, imagine if you're living in a horse stall, and the authorities say, "Well, if you help us build the camp, you could get out of these horse stalls faster." So they asked for volunteers, and I know some of my uncles volunteered, and so people volunteered to build the camp where they were ultimately imprisoned. This is Manzanar. Manzanar was one of most of the camps, people remember them for being hot and dusty, and in Poston, the temperature in the summertime rose to 125 degrees. Nothing grew there. There weren't any trees or anything. This is another one from Manzanar. And all of these camps had guard towers with searchlights and guards standing there with rifles pointing down at the prisoners. But once people got there, they started trying to make their life habitable. Part of it was that they had in the case of my parents, they had 2 kids, and so the goal was to make it more livable for their families. And so they immediately started schools, social clubs. It wasn't meant to be a prison per se, but they couldn't get out. So there was Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and baseball teams and all kinds of activities, schools. They just couldn't leave. Uh-oh. This was a toy swap. You could take, because people didn't have much money, the kids would take their toys and switch them out. This is called, this is a nursery school in one of the camps, and what's really amusing is they're not playing a house, they're playing barracks. And if you can imagine that these camps were 1 square mile and they couldn't get out, how do you entertain yourself? There were a whole lot of people staging plays, having poetry readings, forming bands. Some of it, if this picture speaks for itself, was pretty sad. But this was, they couldn't leave, but they could do things to entertain themselves. So baseball was a big deal. Someone put on a Tolstoy play, all in Japanese. So this was kind of, what they were taken out of their daily lives and just trying to do things to keep themselves from going crazy. As I said, these camps were not built yet. They had to build the roads, to build the infrastructure, to build the camps. So when people got to the camp, when they were there was still a whole lot of scrap lumber around. And in order to build camps to house 120,000 people, they were building with green wood. So as the wood dried, the floorboards opened up and there were huge cracks and dust came out. But this was a stack of some of the scrap lumber that existed after the camps opened. When they got to camp, they was, how do you spend the time? You're stuck there. How do you keep yourself from going nuts? How do you entertain yourself? So art classes sprouted up. There were some internees who were professional artists, and they started teaching art classes. There are other people who simply had a skill, and so people would go to them and say, can you teach me how to do that? So all these classes sort of spontaneously sprouted up, and other people just started doing things on their own. They were crocheting. My mom was a crocheter. They painted. What's interesting is there were a lot of people who had never picked up a brush before, who had never tried, the immigrants who came here at the turn of the century came because there were famines and things like that. So they were working in the fields, and they had no formal artistic training. This man took up the brush, and most of the stuff in my show were done by untrained artists. A lot of people made bird pins, such as the one I have on. The first thing they did when they got to the camps was there was no furniture. There was a metal cot, a potbelly stove, and so it was important to have a chair to sit on. Clothes hangers, making clothes hangers was a big deal. Where do you put things? And so this was one of the early chairs that was made in the camps. This was, and how do you entertain yourself? This was a sketch done by one of the prisoners in Tanforan. And if you look at the words at the bottom, it says record night. So this audience gathers simply so they could listen to records being played. This is interesting because as I said, people volunteered to build the camps so that they could get into the permanent camps faster. What's And then the authorities issued these certificates thanking them for their work. And when I saw it, what's interesting, they put guard towers in all the corners. There's barbed wire fence surrounding it. There's cactus on the bottom. And then you could see the camp barracks at the top. And in this case, this was Hart Mountain, so you could see the mountain in the background. So I don't know if they knew this was ironic or not. I mean, when you see it, but it's the certificate says, "Thank you for all your hard work. You guys did a marvelous job." Basically, that's what it came down to. Now, when they got into camp, they couldn't take metal objects. So one of the things that people did, because they didn't have any tools, was they would raid the automotive pool area, they would collect their forks and spoons, and then they would try to make their own tools. And this one was made by someone who was a farmer. The other thing that was there is, these are called geta. They're platform sandals. And all of the facilities were in other buildings. The only thing that you had in your barrack was your cot, and the living unit had just a cot and nothing else initially. So to use the laundry loom, to use the latrine, to use the shower, you had to go to a separate building, and you didn't want to go in your street shoes. So people start making these guitars to wear when around, so that their street shoes didn't wear out. This is made from crepe paper that was twisted and starched and braided. So they needed some things to put tools, their belongings away. And this is also a door sign. So if you could imagine, all of the barracks looked alike, and in order to distinguish one barrack from another, or one living unit from another, people immediately started making their signs saying who lived there. This one says Yamaichi, but this is one of the first orders of business once they got to the camp, because people kept walking into other people's so it was, and so there are a lot of them. I think in the show here, you have a door sign, and but there are apparently hundreds of them around. This was made by a farmer in Tracy, and it's just a little chest of, just a little curio container. This one I love. This is, if you look inside the drawers, they're just a crate. And somebody took these crates, made a little chest of drawers. They cut branches or limbs crosswise. They glued it onto the crate and then put putty in there and shellacked it. So, and then two of the camps were over ancient seabeds. Tule Lake was in Northern California, and Topaz was over the Bonneville Flats in Utah. And when people got to the camps, they discovered, these two camps, they discovered that just kicking the sand, just all these shells started appearing. And keep in mind, there was no vegetation, there were no trees, no flowers, and when people died or got married or anything, they didn't have, they didn't have flowers to put out. So someone discovered that you could collect these shells, you could sort them, you could bleach them, and you could turn them into corsages, into table ornaments. And then some people were very resourceful and very good, and they also sold them outside of the camps. This is called a sending body, 1,000-stitch sending bodies, 1,000-stitch. Most of them were sashes. And they were done on rice sacks. My dad, who was in the 442nd in Italy, his was sewn on a rice sack. And what this says is that when somebody is sent into harm's way, they are sent off with the good wishes of 1,000 people. So each one of these French tied knots was put on by a different individual. So, and then the tiger was for courage and for returning home. I guess tigers always return to where they came from. This one was done on somebody's slip. This mother had done it on a slip. Most of them were done on a rice sack. Very few of them remain. When I had to, this one was getting very fragile, so I had to give it back to this museum. Then I borrowed another one, had to give that one back. And I asked somebody, why is it so hard to find sending body? You know, you knew that any mother sending her son off to war was going to make one because you had to go off with, you know, it was part of your safety to go off with the good wishes of 1,000 people. You know, what happened to those? There were, 33,000 men who went to Nice's who were in the service? And somebody said, well, you know, most of them were destroyed. The men took it, you know, their mothers usually made it for them, and they took it, but they were so afraid that if their commanding officer inspected their belongings and found it, they'd assume that maybe they were somehow colluding with the enemy. So rather than take that chance, they threw it away. So there aren't a whole lot of them left. It's part of it is that the material was fragile, but I'll tell you, I spent a lot of time looking for them, and that seems like the most logical conclusion that people, and my dad's is gone. This is made Japanese doll. I think somebody donated their kimonos to make these things. If somebody had a talent, then other people would go to them and say, can you show me how to do this? This was done in topaz, and someone had a drawing of the class, and I saw, so one of the internees knew how to make it, and there were maybe 10 women who took her class and made dolls. This is a game called Hanafuda, and it's really popular in the Japanese community. And because people didn't have room in their luggage to take, you know, things that might be somewhat frivolous, this man in camp decided he could make it, and he made a set of Hanafuda cards out of electrician board and painted it. It looks just like the ones that are sold. Anyway, word got out that he knew how to do this, and so then he started getting orders from the other camps. I understand that eventually he made sets of cards for all 10 camps. So this is a Buddhist shrine. Now, if you're a practicing Buddhist, which many of the people in camp were, you had to have a family shrine, and there was no room in the luggage to take their family shrine. So when people got into camp, they would somehow make their own. Someone was telling me that their father made it out of cigar boxes. Other people hollowed out logs, but you have to put your ancestral tablet in there, and every morning you pay your respects to in front of this shrine. And this one was made by these brothers, Nishiori brothers, and they were professional woodworkers before they went into camp. And so when they went into camp, they made more of these things, but this was made without any nails. This was done by a gardener in Oakland. And Topaz had a slate quarry. And so this man found the slate quarry and started carving. He made teapots, he made inkwells, he made teacups. He was really quite talented, but he worked as a gardener before the war, and then after war ended, he went back to gardening. At first, I thought it was really great, but I didn't know where he got it. And he said, someone called me and said, "Do you know when he started carving, where he's from?" And I said, "Well, he was in Utah. When did he start?" And I said, "I don't know." And then she said, "Well, I do." And I said, "How can you be so sure?" She said, "Well, there was an incident in the camp where there was an old man, and he got too close to the fence, and the guard, there was a guard, and the guard yelled, 'Halt!' The man couldn't hear; it was really windy. He was hard of hearing, and when he didn't stop, the guard shot him, and he died." And so the administrator was off site, and he came back and he said to the guards, "Tell all the men to come, to assemble here, bring your rifles." And so when they came, he said, "You guys could keep your guns, but you have to give me all your bullets." Because, there wasn't nobody was trying to escape. So he got all the bullets, and at that point, they opened the barbed wire fence and let people roam outside of the area. And the quarry was on the other side of the fence. So that's how this person knew when he started carving. So this is made out of crepe paper. This is just a little branch, and these are hikers, and it's all one piece. It's really terrific. This is trains, and you could see the parts. There's tin cans, there's watch parts, there's those file folder wires, and he made this all out of, and it runs along the track, which is amazing. And like so many things, this man who made it, one day he just walked into this museum and handed it to them, saying, "Here, I made this and I don't need it." And so that's where they got it. These are bird pins. Thousands of bird pins were made. Oops, sorry. Including the one I'm wearing. I don't know who made my bird pin. It wasn't my mom and it wasn't my dad. I think because there's so many pins made, some people made 20, 30 or more pins, they were giving them away to their friends and stuff. This was out of a sunflower seed on a milk bottle cap. This is a cow carved in Arkansas out of pine wood. This is mesquite. It was from one of the desert countries. This man picked up firewood for the camps, and as he was going along, he'd see interesting shapes, and he'd pick it up, and then he'd take it back, and he'd make things. This was done by my grandfather. We don't know if he did anything else. I'm not too fond of it, except that it was done by my grandfather. Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to keep you guys. This was done by a 16, 17-year-old boy in Tule Lake, and he drew, if you remember the evacuation notice at the start, he drew on the back of the evacuation notice. So these little cards were drawn on that. And later, when they tracked him down and asked him why he used the evacuation notice to draw on, was this some kind of statement? And he said, no, you just couldn't find paper in camp. So, but he was very good at it. Now, the people who were arrested by the FBI and were sent into Justice Department-run camps, they were their cases were heard by a panel, and if they were released to go to another back to join their family in a regular internment camp. These people were in Santa Fe. And when this man was released, the other prisoners signed a handkerchief as a memento for him. This is the evacuation notice written in Japanese on this side. They taped two of them together, and he drew the Tule Lake on the back side. This is Topaz, I believe. And the coal piles, everybody remembers the coal piles. If there wasn't anything to work on, then people would pick up pebbles and draw on pebbles. So pretty much whatever was indigenous to that area, they would work with. Now, in 1944, the government decided that the camps would be closed. They waited until the discussion of closing the camps started every step of the way. And, they started putting people in camp in the spring of 42. In June of 42, after the Battle of Midway and the Japanese Pacific Fleet was defeated, some people said, well, maybe we don't have to put people in camp. The Justice Department and the FBI, who had gone through everybody's homes, said, we don't see any evidence that that these people are dangerous. But there was a group that led this, so that it was really led by special interest groups. And when people were put in camp and they said, well, maybe we shouldn't go through with this. There were a few people in camp, but maybe we don't have to do it. They said, gee, we just spent $80 million. We don't want to lose face. So this, and 2 days before Roosevelt signed the executive order saying that allowing the camps people to be sent into camp, the Justice Department, the Attorney General wrote a letter to Roosevelt saying, don't do this. You're going to tie up the troops. We're going to spend $80 billion building these camps, or $1 million. You're going to tie up the transportation lines. The labor force is already depleted, and you're going to take more people out of the labor force. And then we will need people in the military, and it's gonna take up a lot of valuable manpower. And the other point that he made was that if you do this, he said, what's gonna happen when you want to release these people? Are you creating a situation where they have been wards of the state for so long that you are basically creating like a Native American, reservation situation? Are they going to be afraid? Are they going to be able to resettle? And the truth is that when they decided to close the camps, and the people could leave the camps to go east, they just couldn't go west. If you could find a sponsor, you could leave. But when they announced after 3.5 years you could leave the camps, that's when the greatest number of suicides took place. People didn't know where they could go. They heard that the people on the West Coast were against them. They had lost everything. They knew that they had lost their homes, they had lost their belongings. They didn't, and so it was, when you look at what happened, that was when there was the greatest number of people who just said, I can't, I've lost everything, I can't go home. Because the government had frozen bank accounts. They had, my parents had pretty much lost everything. They put their belongings in storage. And, but of course, everybody knew they were gone. So when, when they got back, anything of value was stolen out of there. So this is, and the discussion of closing the camps came up several times during that 3.5 years. After the Battle of Midway, after when the government decided that they needed to start drafting people from the camps. How do you do that? There was the labor force, there was a shortage in the labor force. And the discussion happened in early 1944, like we should close the camps. Well, that was a presidential election year. They said, we don't want to, this is a hot political issue on the West Coast. So the announcement that the camps were closing didn't happen until December of 44. They said they would close it within 1 year. But these, and everything that was predicted by Biddle really came to pass. But this is the block where my parents lived in Arkansas. So you remember the scenes of the barracks and just the bare land, and the people who went into camp really wanted to make a community for themselves. So in 3 years, this is the block where they lived. You could still sort of see the barracks, but they planted gardens. They put up little awnings over their entry, and they tried to make it much more homey. This was in Arizona, and this ambitious person built a whole harbor scene, a miniature harbor scene. And keep in mind that people didn't have running water in their barracks, so he got the water from the laundry room and managed to build this with the little miniature lighthouse and with the flagpole. But this is one of the scenes. And they put on agricultural shows. By mid-1945, the camps were basically closed. The last of the camps closed in 46. Places like Crystal City, where they had rounded up Japanese living in Peru and parts of South America and sent them to the US and put them in camp. And they could not go back to their home country. When they were sent here, they were told, you're entering the country illegally, although they were not coming voluntarily. And so some of them weren't able to leave the camps until, I think, late 1949. That's the end of the talk, and thank you so much.